So basically what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at how the field formed, where it's at today. So some of the people we'll talk about in some detail throughout the semester. Certainly names that will come up in a variety of places. So a quick review of what we'll do today. We'll talk first of all about how psychology is a science, a scientific discipline. Talk about the origins of psychology, the rise of structuralism, the formal founding of psychology in Leipzig, Germany in the late 19th century. We'll talk a little bit about the 20th century and then talk a bit more about contemporary psychology. Psychology is a pretty young field as a formal discipline, but certainly psychologists have been, or certainly people have been interested in questions of the mind for centuries, certainly as long as civilization can be tracked. But I first want to talk about how psychology is a scientific discipline. We'll spend more time talking about research methods in our next lecture on Wednesday. But the first thing you have to understand is psychology is founded in empirical research, and it's based on observation of behavior. And we'll see that we got a rocky start in this area. We start talking about Wilhelm Wundt and his methodology, but he really believed they were observing behavior. They were observing the mind's behavior. We certainly, from a modern perspective, talk a lot about the intersections between physiology and behavior and how physiology and behavior are related to one another. Certainly, mind and brain are important interrelated topics. We can argue the philosophical distinctions between mind and brain later. But we know that memory, consciousness, all of this arises from the brain somewhere. Final note here is one of the areas that it's important to understand is that research psychology and the practice of psychology are not mutually exclusive. That is, people who are clinicians are not scientists. They are scientist practitioners. That is, they have knowledge in science. They understand research processes. Many of them conduct research themselves. So psychologists are scientist practitioners like any other physician, etc. So science and the practice of psychology are not mutually exclusive. They're complementary. They're both grounded in empirical evidence. So this semester we're going to talk entirely about how the science of psychology has led us to where we are today, to how we know about things like personality, how we know about things like memory and attention. All of those things will be grounded in this empirical method. We'll spend some more time talking about in our next class. So keep in mind from the start that this is a scientific discipline. Despite what some of our colleagues in the hard sciences say, we do conduct science just like anyone else using the scientific method. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the origins of psychology. I'm not somebody who likes to dwell on the past. I think it's important to have a basic understanding of how we arrived here, so we're going to skip lightly through the centuries. This will be the fastest review of all of modern history, or certainly all of history that you've ever gotten. Psychology has its roots in ancient Greece, certainly. Aristotle is sort of one of the first to talk about things like memory and on the soul. In fact, psychology is actually based on the Greek word for study of the soul, or study of the psyche. So Aristotle wrote on the soul. He wrote on memory and reminiscences. In fact, Aristotle was the first to propose, to our knowledge, that there might be different kinds of memory. So a shorter-term form of memory and a longer-term form of memory. Plato, of course, in the allegory of the cave, which is part of the Republic. The allegory of the cave was Plato's belief that mankind, we didn't see the world directly. That is, we didn't experience the world directly. We actually were like someone in a cave watching shadows move by outside, and we actually inferred that things were happening outside the cave. Plato wasn't wrong. We don't perceive the world in entirely accurate ways. In fact, much of what we do, much of our perceptions are generated by our expectations. That is, we construct our own visual reality based on our own experiences. And so he wasn't entirely wrong in that we interpret our world around us, and in fact our interpretations are almost more important than the sensations themselves. And then finally there was Galen, who's a Greek physician who was very interested in studying mind, and he used to, back in the ancient times, talk about the different humors, and if they got out of balance, then that's how you ended up with mental illness. So we start, basically in the most ancient of times, as civilization starts to rise, so does our quest for understanding human behavior and our relationships with one another, and how essentially our minds and souls work. So out of these philosophical traditions, we start to get the rise of some basic philosophies that are how psychology really gets its start. Nativism is the philosophical view that certain kinds of knowledge are innate or born. This is one of those areas that kind of comes and goes. As I was sort of training to be a psychologist, we sort of believed that we were born tabula rasa, that is sort of blank slates, and everything grew through our experience. There is emerging evidence of inheritance of some memories. Some people believe that you can inherit ancestral memories. We certainly know that your ancestors' experiences get handed down in epigenetic alterations. And so the nativists may not have been wrong. That is, it might be possible that some of your behaviors are due to the fact that 2 generations ago your grandparents went through some sort of trauma, because that trauma then alters epigenetic changes, and that then is inherited down through the generations. Philosophical empiricism is the philosophical view that all knowledge is acquired through experience. And certainly, as modern psychologists, we are empiricists. That is, we gain all of our knowledge through scientific research, by observing the world around us, and by gaining that knowledge through our experience and interactions with people in our research studies. So this is the view that our knowledge is acquired through experience. And certainly, psychology has waxed and waned in terms of its devotion to empiricism, but modern psychologists are all party empiricists who are interested in observable behavior, observable phenomena. So these are the couple of philosophical traditions that directly relate to some of our modern views of psychology. So we will move on. That was ancient times. Now we're going to skip quickly through the Renaissance and the 19th century, talk about some issues that are associated with who we became today. So the first of these sort of stop-offs is in the Renaissance. And then we'll talk a little bit about the 19th century, but let's start by talking about Descartes and the Renaissance. Descartes is a French philosopher who's particularly of importance to psychology because of his interest in the mind-brain problem. That he was interested in trying to figure out if the mind and brain were the same thing, or if the mind and brain were different structures. And so this is the monist versus dualist debate, and of course then we end up with Cartesian dualism, which is this idea that mind and body are separate but interact together at the pineal gland, which is weird. It turns out, of course, that's not right, but that was Descartes' idea. Descartes, of course, is also a rationalist, and as Descartes wasn't much of an empiricist, this is back when you didn't really have access to laboratories, and so philosophers just sat around and thought about stuff. And so Descartes' sort of most famous for his I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, and essentially his thinking was, well, do I exist? In order to ask the question, do I exist, I have to be able to think. In order to think, I must exist, so therefore I must exist. Not exactly groundbreaking, but it's kind of what it was at the time. So these are the kind of rationalist traditions we'll talk about later. And you kind of think back on it and go, that's not really all that exciting, but at the time, probably a revelation. They didn't have TV. So then we get into the 19th century, and this is where things start to really take shape in terms of what we are as modern psychologists. Franz Joseph Gall is, of course, right at the 18th, 19th century. Gall is responsible for espousing a view of brain and behavior called phrenology. And the phrenologists believed that, and Gall believed, that specific mental abilities and characteristics were localized in specific regions of the brain. That part's probably right. The part they got wrong was that those parts of the brain would grow, and as a result, you could tell what somebody's abilities were by the bumps on their head. And so phrenologists would read the bumps on your head to figure out what you were like. Actually, if you're interested, in my office, I have a phrenology head that shows you what parts of the skull are associated with what properties. So this is the first attempt at localization, which is something we're actually still doing in neuroscience, trying to localize functions in the brain. Now, Gall had this idea that the brain grew and the skull grew. We know that's entirely wrong. The skull just grows together and the brain does its own thing. The problem is, I sometimes look at some fMRI work and think, are we just phrenologists? That is, well, what are we doing in fMRI? fMRI is where we measure where the brain's using blood. And it turns out, this is the reason I wasn't exactly very far off. In much of the neuroscience research, somebody did some of the math underlying the assumptions in functional magnetic resonance imaging work was wrong, and there's some 10,000 research papers that now all have to be sort of rethought because of that math error. So I like to talk about the phrenologists because they thought they had it right there, and so we now have to question whether or not everything we know is right too. You can tell I'm a bit of a skeptic. I'm really fun to live with. I'm constantly like, I don't know, that might not be true. Really pain in the ass. Yeah, I don't think I would be a good journalist because I wouldn't believe anything. So Paul Broca is sort of the next person I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. Of course, there's lots of other people in the field, but Broca studied brain damage patients, in particular the sort of left frontal parietal area, to link localization to ability. In fact, he discovered what we call Broca's area. Broca's area is an area associated with language. We'll talk about later in the semester what's called Broca's aphasia. So Broca is one of the earliest people to try to localize function in the brain. You have to understand the immense challenge of doing neuroscience research in these times. We obviously can't study the brain. The only reason people even know what the brain even looks like is that a few of them have managed to dissect cadavers. During this time period, during much of the time, certainly during the Renaissance, it was illegal to dissect a body. In fact, some of these sort of classic philosophers and scientists in this area used to have to steal bodies. Kind of weird and creepy. But if you think about it, in 1850, the only way to figure out what part of the brain was damaged is to wait until somebody dies and then open their skull and see what's damaged. And that's what Broca did. So that's how this research was conducted. In fact, a lot of the earliest research, even in modern times, was done mostly post-mortem. There's a very famous study by Simon LeVay on sexual orientation in the brain that was conducted entirely post-mortem on the hypothalamus of gay males in San Francisco in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. So we start to then get this question about the structures of the brain and the rise of the idea that physiology is involved. And so the study of biological processes, particularly in the human body. Here we get Hermann von Helmholtz, who is interested in studying human reaction times and estimating the length of a nervous impulse. Von Helmholtz also invented the ophthalmoscope, that thing your doctor uses to look in your eye. He's the person who invented that. This is one of his early Helmholtz models. So start to introduce a little bit of lingo. You're going to discover that a big part of this course is learning a bunch of new lingo. When we talk about a stimulus, we're talking about some sensory input from the environment. Von Helmholtz was interested in studying reaction time because he thought this was a way in which he could figure out how long it took somebody to process information. So basically the amount of time taken to respond to a specific stimulus is what we call reaction time. And so von Helmholtz was interested in trying to figure out how fast nervous impulses were firing in order to try to determine different kinds of processes. So he would study this sort of stimulus reaction time and try to figure out how fast nervous impulses were traveling. So we start to get this interest in how our physiology relates to our behavior. So, important historical note is Wilhelm Wundt. He's a student of von Helmholtz. Wundt forms the first formal laboratory in psychology in Leipzig, Germany. So, Helmholtz actually is sort of the grandfather of psychology, if we consider Wundt the father of psychology. So this is where we start to get sort of the pedigree of psychology, formally starting with von Helmholtz. Where I went to graduate school at Colorado State, they have a project where all of the professors that are part of the department, someone looks into their academic lineage. That is, they look at their PhD advisor and their PhD advisor and their PhD advisor, and most everyone goes back to Wundt. So this is where we get the formal founding of the first psychological laboratory is in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So while people have been studying these kinds of processes, this is the first declaration of a laboratory to study psychology. Wundt is interested in studying our conscious experience. So a person's subjective experience of the world and of their own mind is where Wundt is placing his interests. They were what we call structuralists, which was the analysis of basic elements that constitute the mind. This is the first time people start to try to parse apart our conscious awareness and our abilities, which is an interesting place to start, right? We now know, of course, that there are things that are automatic and controlled. We also know, of course, that there are things that we remember and things that we don't. But this is the first to try to break that into its constituent components, so the structure of the mind. Now, of course, as modern cognitive psychologists, we simply think of these things as attention, and memory, and working memory. But this is that first attempt to try to piece that apart. The problem with most of the work being done in Wundt's lab is it is introspective. That is, this is the subjective observation of one's own experience, where instead of observing external behavior, so like a good empiricist would, they thought it was empirically fine to pay attention to their own minds and then report that. And so they would do these kind of weird things. They would look at something like an apple and then try to piece apart all of their processes involved in experiencing when they knew it was an apple. Did I see that it was red first? Did I see that it was round first? Did I know it was an apple first? Seems kind of crazy. It's the first sort of way in which they try to piece this apart. And so they're their own participants and they're reporting their own subjective awareness. They, of course, couldn't know what we know now, that our subjective awareness of our own cognitive processes is terrible. But this is where we get our start. A contemporary of Wilhelm Wundt is one of my favorite people in psychological history, Hermann von Ebbinghaus. It's nice to know that the hipster beard has a long, fruitful history. Ebbinghaus was a bit of a rebel in his time. He was a contemporary of Wilhelm Wundt, but he had this crazy idea that we should be able to verify observations. So we ought to be able to actually empirically test something like memory. In fact, he was so out of step with the times that he couldn't get any funding, couldn't get any students, kind of did all of this stuff on his own. What Ebbinghaus did was he actually figured out a way to study memory in a way that was entirely empirical, at least to the best of his ability. The first thing he created were these nonsense syllables. And basically, these are what we call a consonant, vowel, consonant triad, which is a syllable that doesn't make a word. So it's something like pag. It's not a word, but it's a syllable that sounds like it could be part of a word, right? At least I don't think that's a word. Well, why was he interested in using these nonsense syllables? Well, he wanted to have things that had no associations with them. That is, so that he could study memory in its sort of purest form. Because he knew that he wouldn't have any prior association with these concepts because they're not related to any concepts. And so what he would do is he would create sort of lists of these things, and he would memorize them. And he would see how long it took him to memorize the list until he could repeat it from memory perfectly. Then he would come back in a little while and see how long it took him to memorize it the second time. So if it took him 2 minutes to memorize the list the first time and 90 seconds the second time, then his saving score was 30 seconds because it took him 30 seconds less to memorize the list. The reason I tell you both of these things is because both of these methods are still used by cognitive psychologists. In fact, I saw both of these things used at the conference I went to last fall. So these are incredibly long-lasting contributions to the literature. He's the one who first studied the spacing effect that we talked about, and the first person to look at what we call a forgetting curve, so how forgetting occurs over time. So in that Karpicki-Roediger paper that we talked about on how the testing effect works, they look at a forgetting function, right? Because they looked at how memory was immediately, 5 minutes later, then the next day, and then a week later. That's what Ebbinghaus did. He looked at forgetting as a function over time. And so that's a method we use a great deal today. So it's an important contribution. A student of Wundt's is Edward Titchener. He studied under Wundt and focused on identifying these basic elements of the mind. He's sort of responsible for bringing psychology to America. So he studies under Wundt and then comes to America and talks about what he had learned there. He's not the first to formally start his own psychology laboratory in the United States, but he is one of the first to bring the sort of idea of psychology back to America. You got to remember this is the late 19th century. Information from Germany had to travel by boat. So he was sort of the first person to bring that to the New World, as it were. But he's an important part of this structuralist tradition as well. G. Stanley Hall is, I think, one of the earliest American psychologists. Very big. He founded actually a psychology journal. He was at Johns Hopkins, and was very interested in developmental psychology. Very long-lasting contributions. Every year at the American Psychological Association, someone gives the G. Stanley Hall lecture. I believe he's one of the people that helped found the American Psychological Association. So he's an important person we'll talk a little bit more about throughout the semester. William James is someone many of you may have heard of. He founded the first psychology lab in America at Harvard. He's sort of considered what we call the dean of American psychology. James was very interested in a lot of different areas. He's not a structuralist, that he wasn't interested in looking at these individual components of thought. He was what we call a functionalist, that he was interested in how these things function and why. Why is it adaptive to have a certain kind of behavior? How is it functional for a species to have certain abilities? James was very sort of taken with the work of Charles Darwin. And so you sort of see some clear Darwinian components to James's writings as he talks about these sort of adaptation and functional adaptations of certain abilities. Other areas that James was very interested in include education. He's got a very well-known text called Talks to Teachers, And he was also very interested in the psychology of religion. In fact, one of his other major pieces of work is called The Varieties of Religious Experience. So some of you may read that in either religion classes or philosophy classes. It's also another classic. So James is a very prolific writer, very influential in the founding of psychology. So, brief note about James and the functional approach. James is the first to take this sort of scientific approach to study psychology. He wrote the Principles of Psychology, so sort of a founding document. Again, he was a functionalist. The study of the purpose of mental processes that serve in enabling people to adapt to their environment. So rather than looking at this from a structural approach, he wanted to know the function of things and why we were able to do certain things and not others, and how did that relate to something like survival. So if you take Darwinism and think about it from a psychological perspective, we're talking about why these functions may have arisen and how we may have adapted to our environment through these kinds of functions. So Charles Darwin, of course, wrote The Origin of Species as a means of natural selection. And this is one of the things that very much inspired William James to start thinking about things from a functional perspective. Certainly, my sort of philosophical view of why people should study psychology is much more of a functionalist perspective. That is, how they work and why, and how they function for us in everyday society. Less so about how it's evolutionarily adaptive, because most of us aren't running through the forest shopping for we go to the grocery store, we don't have to pick berries or hunt species anymore. So a lot of the things that we may have adapted our use for are not necessarily how we do things today. But we can oftentimes talk about how evolutionary adaptation may sort of conflict with our modern society, and we'll do that a bit. So, of course, natural selection is the features of an organism that help it survive and reproduce are more likely than other features to be passed on to subsequent generations. We're going to talk about evolutionary psychology, and this is certainly the basis of evolutionary psychology, is this idea of natural selection. This takes on a variety of components, so we can talk about things like why the visual system adapted the way it did. We are the species that is essentially adapted to function during the day, not at night. We talk about our auditory system and how it's adapted really to hear certain frequencies. And certainly one of the biggest questions about sort of evolutionary psychology is why we have such strong linguistic abilities versus other species. So also using the functional approach is G. Stanley Hall, the first experimental psychologist to set up shop in North America. He focused on development and education and founded the American Journal of Psychology. So another important contributor to the rise of psychology in America. So these, certainly James and Hall, inspired a little bit by Darwin, really shape a lot of our views of modern psychology and how it developed throughout the 20th century. So these views are sort of fundamental to our founding and to a lot of the ways in which people approach studying behavior. So it's important to understand that this is kind of the philosophical tradition we arise from. Some other basic foundational points to note is Jean-Martin Charcot studied hysteric patients through hypnosis. Hysteria was a temporary loss of cognitive or motor function, usually as a result of emotionally upsetting experiences. We don't call it hysteria anymore. We obviously have a much more nuanced view of mental health than people who are either hysterical or perfectly mentally healthy. But this is the earliest sort of attempt at studying people with serious mental illness. And this is when we start to get Sigmund Freud and his use of psychoanalysis. And, of course, he was very interested in hypnosis as well. So we start to try to understand people's mental diseases and disorders, particularly hysteria in this case, and how they might be associated with emotional experiences, particularly in their past. So Freud, of course, starts developing his beliefs about human behavior and it being associated with developmental issues and unconscious mind and how it might influence our behavior. We're going to talk about Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in very brief, couple of brief places. Freud had some important things to contribute to the field. Certainly his questions of the conscious mind versus the unconscious mind. It's an important thing we study quite a bit today. We'll talk about his theory of personality from a historical interest perspective, and that's really about it. The important thing to understand about psychoanalysis is there's no empirical evidence that it actually works. And in fact, very few insurance companies will actually cover the cost of psychoanalysis. So according to Freud, hysteria is caused from painful unconscious experiences. This is again why we get this really important contribution of the conscious versus the unconscious mind. The unconscious is the part of the mind that operates outside of our awareness, but influences conscious thoughts, feelings, and actions. And certainly, Freud had this right. We certainly have things that are outside of our conscious awareness. As a cognitive psychologist, we study conscious and not conscious forms of memory, what we call implicit memories. We talk about conscious awareness of some activities, whereas other things we're not consciously aware of. And certainly, a very important area that people talk about now is unconscious prejudice. People may have prejudiced views of which they aren't consciously aware. And so we'll talk about these in a variety of areas. Freud is responsible for developing psychoanalytic theory. This is an approach to understanding human behavior that emphasizes the importance of unconscious mental processes in shaping feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Basically, the point of psychoanalysis was to dig past people's conscious awareness and into the unconscious mind, because the belief was that it's all of our unconscious motivations that are screwing up our life. And we have to figure out where those unconscious motivations come from. And so that's where hypnosis would come into play, free association comes into play, dream analysis comes into play. The problem with a lot of these techniques is, aside from the fact that they don't generally make anyone better, is they also can actually make people worse. That is, you can actually, through these techniques, get people to remember things that didn't happen, and we kind of don't want that. And so this is not a technique that's done anymore, because we now understand that people are depressed because of a brain disorder, about schizophrenia because of a brain disorder, or bipolar disorder because they have disordered neurotransmitter systems. And so while we start to get the attempt at treating mental illness, it's not a very successful attempt, but there are some important components to talk about. Another important figure here is Carl Jung, kind of a disciple of Freud's, but broke away from him later. And so people talk about Jungian analysis. Jung had some weird stuff. He was interested in astrology. And one of the things that Jung actually had this idea about, which is really interesting, was collective unconscious or collective consciousness. This idea that we as societies have this sort of collective awareness. And it's not entirely wrong. Certainly our beliefs and our stories and our ideas sort of manifest themselves together, but not really in the way that Jung thought. So that gets us to the 20th century. I'm going to provide a skim through some of the highlights of the 20th century. And how it developed. As a Gestalt psychologist, really interesting group of people. The Gestalt psychologists all kind of primarily ended up in the United States because of the rise of the Third Reich in Germany. So Max Wertheimer is very interested in studying creativity and what we call productive thinking. The idea is we have productive thinking and reproductive thinking. Reproductive thinking is where basically you reproduce what somebody else thought. Productive thinking is when you have a genuinely original thought. What's interesting about this is Max Wertheimer and Albert Einstein ended up at Harvard together, and would spend a lot of time together. That is, they sort of fled Germany at the same time. And so Einstein was actually sort of a point of inspiration for Wertheimer, and so they would spend a lot of time talking so that Wertheimer could try to figure out how he was such an original thinker. The other interesting thing about the Gestalt psychologists were that they were very interested in perception. In fact, that's what we'll talk about the Gestalt psychologists the most. Gestalt doesn't really have a good translation in English. The basic idea is that our experience is more than the sum of its pieces. We call this a trans-sum event. That is, if you put all the pieces of perception together, you're not going to come up with what we actually perceive. An example. This is a classic Gestalt phenomenon. That is, you experience the perception of a 3D cube that doesn't exist. What does exist are these black circles with parts of them missing. What your brain does is it takes those pieces and it fills it in and it makes something different. This is actually more than, when people talk about Gestalt, they always talk about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. That's a sort of rough translation, but that's what's happening here, is our perception is something more than or other than or different than just the pieces of perception together. So it creates a new experience that is distinct from its individual components. So the Gestalt psychologists are kind of their own sort of side nexus in studying of psychology. The major action happens with the behaviorists, and the behaviorists really kind of take over. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we start to get this increasing interest in strictly empirical psychology. The behaviorists were strict empiricists. That is, if you couldn't see it, you couldn't talk about it, certainly from Skinner and Watson's perspective. So what they were interested in is studying learning, primarily. So we'll talk about how they studied things like how animals learn, how people learn, through reward and punishment. So this is where we start to get things like positive reinforcement. But the biggest thing that they're known for, again, is their very strict empiricism and their belief that the mind was something we just didn't talk about. It was a black box that we could never know. So you could talk about the stimulus that we present, say a rat with a light, and then it eventually learns to press this lever every time the light comes on and it gets rewarded. So we can talk about all the processes that we can observe, but nothing else. So we'll spend some time talking about the ways in which they studied animals. These are actually called Skinner boxes, so these were invented by B.F. Skinner. We'll talk about John Watson and his unfortunate studies with little Albert, in which he conditioned little Albert to be afraid of stuffed animals. And Ivan Pavlov, who sort of accidentally discovered what we call classical conditioning. But this sort of strict empirical tradition really takes over psychology, and in fact, it's not until the 1950s and 60s that we get the rise of cognitive psychology. So prior to 1950s and 60s, we talked about learning from a fairly strict perspective. In fact, the Journal of Memory and Language, which is a current journal, used to be the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior. Around the 1950s, there is a growing dissatisfaction with what we can know about the human experience through behaviorists. That is, we can't really explain all of what we can do as people through systems of rewards and punishment. There has to be more than that. So in the 1950s, we start to get studies in perception, memory, knowledge, problem solving, and decision making. The early players in this field are people like George Miller. George Miller worked for Bell Laboratories and was tasked with studying how many things people could remember in a row. And so Miller did a whole series of experiments where he ended up with a very influential paper called the magical number 7. As Miller came to the conclusion that we could remember the average human about 7 plus or minus 2 things, which is one of the reasons why we have 7-digit telephone numbers. At the same time, there's this very famous feud that sort of launches between B.F. Skinner, who is a behaviorist, and Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is, of course, a very famous linguist and they got into this sort of dispute about how people acquired language. And I think Chomsky kind of came up the winner, and so we get the beginnings of cognitive psychology. One of the other things that happens at this time is this is when computers start becoming a thing. And people start using computer-based analogies to try to understand human behavior. And so what's happening at this time is people talk about information processing much like you would with a computer. So we get sort of information in, process, and then information back out. Also in the 20th century, we start to get the rise of social psychology. Social psychology is primarily involved with focusing on behavior sort of at the societal or interpersonal level, so not necessarily all the way up at large societies, but at a social level. We talk about individuals and groups and our interactions with individuals and groups and how we act towards each other. It's sort of hard to say exactly which direction this causal arrow goes, but certainly World War II spurred a great deal of interest in social psychology, and certainly World War II had a strong influence on what social psychology became. And the reason for that is the U.S. Army was suddenly tasked with this, well, the U.S. military, I should say, with this sudden, very difficult task, if you think about it from a historical perspective, because we now have several million people we have to place in jobs, we have to place in units, and we have to figure out a way to do that in the most efficient and effective way possible. You know, you can't just have somebody show up and go, okay, well, you should go, you know, just eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So we get social psychologists who start to do things like test people to figure out what they're good at. Anyone ever taken the Strong-Campbell interest battery? Remember that? It was supposed to tell you what you wanted to be when you were an adult? Yeah. Turns out I'm not a lawyer, although I almost was, so I guess that almost counted. The Strong-Campbell interest battery is one of those areas. The ASVAB, I'm going to take a match. The Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. That's where we start to get how to put people into specific jobs in the military. This is how we get the rise of what we call industrial organizational psychology. Have you ever had a retail job? How many of you had to figure out what color your personality was to get that job? Nobody? I'm the only one that's worked at American Eagle? American Eagle makes you do that. I don't know why. Yeah, I worked at American Eagle for a while, doing floor set. I just wanted the discount. Anyway, but in order to do that, I had to figure out what color my personality was. And the whole time I was thinking, like, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. And it was. It's one of those. So anyway, people do a lot of personality assessments as part of industrial organizational psychology. I do have friends and colleagues who are very interested in how, like, for example, those are valid or not and how people fake them. So, you know, you can't ask somebody, are you going to steal from us? Right? So you have to figure out a way to figure out whether or not they're going to steal through a bunch of other weird questions. And so that's how you get this sort of rise of these kind of, you know, IO psychologists. And IO psychologists are everywhere, and they all make more money than I do. But they do lots of, you know, some interesting things. So this is the rise of social psychology. We'll talk more about social psychology later on in the semester, but this is a really important topic contemporarily. We'll talk about Elizabeth Sheriff's work on in-group, out-group distinctions. That is, you know, if somebody's part of a group that's different from ours, that affects how we perceive them. And so that's certainly got some important components. Neuroscience is certainly one of the areas where we are doing a lot of work these days. President Obama's brain initiative is ongoing. Lots of work in trying to understand how the brain works. Certainly the sort of latest, biggest field, certainly technology-driven. As we start talking about neuroscience, we're going to talk about the various techniques that are used. one of those areas that's getting harder and harder to try to keep up. So there are certain techniques we use to study electrical activity in the brain. You can study where your brain's using oxygen through functional magnetic resonance imaging. You can look at magnetic fluctuations in the brain caused by neural firing. You can look at where the brain is using particular kinds of chemicals. We're now to the point where we can actually manipulate the sort of living brain through transcranial cortical stimulation and transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is a very big field, from molecular neurobiology, certainly optico. There's now this whole brand, very new field of opticogenetics, where they're studying how they can turn memories on and off in mice. We'll actually see this in a film later in the semester. They essentially incorporate a bioluminescent algae gene into the rat's DNA, or to the mouse's DNA structure. And then as a result, they can sort of code memories with a drug injection, and then later shine a laser into the brain and turn those memories on and off. It's totally freaky. But this is a huge area right now. There's so much going on in this area that it's almost impossible to keep up. So this is an area where we start to see development of some of the specific subfields in sort of interdisciplinary fields. And cognitive neuroscience is certainly what I would call an interdisciplinary field. Cognitive neuroscience is sort of the studying of how brain results in cognitive abilities and how the two are associated. Carl Lashley is one of the earliest to work in this area. Lashley was interested in finding or studying what we call the engram. And Lashley studied rats, fortunately, otherwise he would have gone through a lot of people, trying to find where memory was located. So the search for the engram was, where is memory in the brain located? And so he would take a rat, he would teach it something, then he would do surgery, take out part of the brain, bring it back, and all of his rats were still able to do everything. Unless he basically destroyed most of their entire brain, they were still able to do all of the things that he had already taught them. The problem was that Lashley was studying where the memories were stored. Turns out memories are distributed everywhere in the brain. What Lashley really needed to study was how memories are formed. That's where all the action is. And in fact, it's pretty easy to damage the brain so that new memories won't form again. So we get the development of behavioral neuroscience, which is an approach to psychology that links psychological processes to specific activities in the nervous system and other bodily processes. Most behavioral neuroscientists use animal models. Not all of them, but most of behavioral neuroscience is sort of located in studying animals, rats, mice, snails. It's easier to study these sort of biological molecular mechanisms in animal species, certainly sort of low-cost animal species like rats and mice. So a lot of the field works in that area. So we use brain scanning techniques too, and that's where most cognitive neuroscience techniques are done. This is the field that attempts to understand the links between cognitive processes and brain activity. And this is an area where the psychology department at Georgetown does a great deal of its work, certainly the research, in conjunction with the medical center. So cognitive neuroscientists will study intact, sort of normal individuals and see how their brains are reacting. In a functional magnetic resonance imaging study, they'll look at how the brain is using oxygen with the assumption that where oxygen is being used, that's where the brain's busy. We can also do things like introduce drugs. So in some of my work, we gave people a dose of Versed, or what's called midazolam, which causes very dense amnesia for very brief periods of time. And so we were able to actually study how conscious and unconscious forms of memory differ by actually causing no conscious memories to form during the study episode. So there's lots of ways in which this is done. So this is a very big field, lots of really interesting work going on in these areas. To give you an idea what some of this looks like, this is a PET scan of healthy, or of the difference between healthy and Alzheimer's brains. One of the areas we often look at in cognitive neuroscience is looking at healthy participants versus people with some sort of disease or disorder. It really makes it cognitive neuropsychology. And here what we're looking at is where there are significant differences in the brain activity of these patients. And you can see some of those areas lit up. Okay, I've got a TOPHAT question for you. That done. So we can get the text answer. Okay, so answer first is cognitive psychology. What's the wrong guy? So other areas in contemporary psychology, we've sort of gotten much more into subdisciplines. So we'll talk a little bit about modern psychology and its different areas. Certainly the vast majority of psychologists are clinical or counseling psychologists. This can include areas like psychopharmacology, where people look at how drugs can be used to treat people with diseases and disorders. So most clinical and counseling psychologists are basically there to help people get better, either to treat very clinically ill patients or even, get people through some tough patches in life. So psychopharmacology, psychiatry. Psychiatrists are medical doctors who go through some advanced training to become psychiatrists, whereas most psychologists have PhDs or PsyDs, all of them I should say, in either clinical psychology or counseling psychology. Those people are generally involved in the sort of traditional talk therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, other forms of sort of counseling sessions. They can be things from a psychodynamic perspective. Most people tend to work in the cognitive behavioral therapy area or the person-centered or client-centered areas. Some group therapy still being done. And certainly there are some very important components of group therapy. Later on in the semester, if we get to talking about schizophrenia, one of the important things to do with schizophrenia patients is to work with their sort of social support network in a group therapy session to get them sort of on board with the person's treatment. So these different kinds of talk therapies have important goals to them. So cognitive behavioral therapies are designed to get people to think about situations differently and to respond differently in more healthy and helpful ways. So other areas of contemporary psychology include industrial organizational psychology, which is involved in working with organizations and industries to try to benefit them, to try to make them more efficient, try to make their workers more happy, healthier, etc. Things like how to select good employees, how to motivate employees, all of that is IO psychology. Neuroscience, there are, of course, many different types of neuroscience, but really we think about this oftentimes from a levels of analysis. So people working in molecular neurobiology are looking at the molecular level about how neurotransmitters bind to the cell receptors and how those molecules interact with one another, how they fit like locks and keys, how our experiences can alter genetic protein signals and change our genetic structures and all sorts of interesting stuff. So the neurobiologists are more interested in how the cells interact with one another, how cells grow, how we create new neuronal cells, how they interact with one another, so at the cellular level. Then we get people who work in things like cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology. And neuropsychologists are generally people who are studying or helping people who have some sort of brain injury or disorder. So a neuropsychologist is who you go to if you had a brain injury or a brain tumor, who might help you try to learn ways to cope with that. So cognitive psychology. Then we have social psychology. Really, IO is kind of part of social psychology. We still have people doing work in sort of the basic behaviorist tradition. And there's lots of people working in cross-disciplinary fields. So things like sport psychology. This involves both things like organizations, how people work in groups, but also individual motivation, a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of motivational counseling, that sort of thing. Environmental psychologists are really interested in how we interact with our environment and how our environment might affect us. So people who are interested in environmental psychology are interested in things like, how does a wilderness experience influence our psychological well-being? Do we need things like wilderness experiences? How do people interact with their environment, and how does that go back to them? And then developmental psychology is an area somewhat on its own, but it involves all of these other different areas. So people who work in developmental psychology look at how our psychology changes across the lifespan. They might be a cognitive developmental psychologist interested in developmental cognition. They might be a social, whatever that is, developmental psychologist figuring out or looking at how people's social interactions change over time. So it really is a genuinely interdisciplinary field. There are other areas, but these are the kind of major areas of psychology that we can talk about. Now, with the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about sort of some general areas in contemporary psychology. So the American Psychological Association began in 1892. A couple of historical highlights: Mary Whitton Calkins was the first female APA president. Kenneth Clark was the first African-American APA president. Being academics, we of course had to get into a fight and split off and form another foundation. So we also have the Association for Psychological Science. Both of these are headquartered here in Washington. Actually, the American Psychological Association owns a huge bunch of real estate in downtown D.C. APS is located over off the DuPont Circle. So the Association for Psychological Science was essentially founded as a split between the clinicians and the experimental psychologists. So APA is, in general, dominated by clinicians, but not entirely. I'm working on the APA program myself. The Association for Psychological Science tends to be more cognitive psychologists, more experimental psychologists, and social psychologists. But certainly they aren't entirely separate. We start to see a growing role for women and minorities throughout the field, which has been very exciting. The American Psychological Association has quite a few divisions interested in these kind of cross-cultural types of psychology. There's Division 44, which is a society for the study of, so basically gays, lesbians, transgender issues. There are lots of different areas of APA that study these kinds of, there's certainly the psychology in women and lots of gender studies issues. So we get growing diversity in psychology, which has been great. It was a very sort of white male field for a long time. Certainly, it's discipline by discipline. Developmental psychology is primarily women. Sort of kind of traditionally has been. Cognitive psychology in my field has been more male, and it's changing over time, so certainly that's been nice to see. I did want to point out that we do have organizations that undergraduates can join. PsyChi is the Psychology Honor Society. So I can show you that. If you just go to this webpage, the International Honor Society in Psychology. So Dr. Green is someone who is responsible for that. You can kind of read all about that here. So I want to finish up just talking about kind of what psychologists do in sort of a modern sense. I think we'll be done early. Many undergraduate psychology students are going to move on to graduate school and conduct research, but not all of them. Some of them will go on to graduate school and then go into practice. Others would go on to conduct research, like myself and others in this department. That tends to then involve doing things like postdoctoral fellowships, where you get to work for on research for another faculty mentor, and sort of really this is kind of like the residency for academic scholarships or academic psychologists. And then people go on to get faculty positions or do research in industry. Lots of people working in doing psychological research in industry. In fact, the last conference I was at, Microsoft was there recruiting cognitive psychologists. So there are a variety of career paths that students who stay in psychology can do. Certainly clinical psychology is a big part of that. Counseling psychology, school psychologists, IO psychologists, these are all just a few. Lots of people who do consulting, certainly in IO psychology. So it's not just going on to be a therapist, but there are lots of other things as well. So to give you an idea about how the field parses out, about half of psychologists are clinical psychologists, a few clinical neuropsychologists, counselors. Health psychology is a new field, where people are starting to look at how this is kind of an outcropping of what we call behavioral medicine, where we start looking at how people's behavior intersects with their health and how their health intersects with their behavior. So we're trying to get people to exercise, that sort of thing. Goes in there. School and educational psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, experimental. Pure experimental psychology is kind of waning. We have IO psychologists and the neurosciences. So we have other applied fields and other research subfields. And those are people that just answered weird on a form. So that's kind of an introduction to psychology. These are some review questions you can take a look at on your own time. It's all posted online. We're done just a little bit early. Do they have any questions about these fields? All right, we'll get into the meat of the topic on Wednesday. See you guys then.